So this is a follow-up. This is really a new thing we're doing in the Summer Fellows Program to emphasize things like the state, governance, service delivery, and so forth, and for the reasons that we've indicated. So I'm going to overlap a little bit with what Jeremy Weinstein said this morning, but I believe I have part of an answer to his question. So at the end of his session, everybody was horribly depressed and said, all this stuff we're trying to do to increase transparency and accountability in governments doesn't seem to be working, or there's no empirical evidence, and where do we go from here? So I don't necessarily have an answer for how to make your government work better, but I do think I know where good quality government comes from, and I don't actually think it comes from the sources, necessarily the sources that he mentioned. So let's just go over this. So this is just my favorite saying. It's attributed to Goldman Sachs, but in my experience in doing public policy my whole life, I actually think that if people can execute on doing things in organizations, that'll be 90% of the job, because actually many of the things that governments try to do, like provide education, public health, roads, infrastructure, rule of law, and so forth, are not controversial, right? They're not controversial. The big problem, and you don't need to know that teachers, for example, ought to show up when they're given a job in the public education system. But the problem is they don't, and the question is, how do you make them show up? And that's a question of execution or implementation rather than a matter of public policy. So let me just go over this. This is, in a way, old news, but I just want to illustrate something. So this is one way of looking at what states do, governments do. So if you twist your head over, this chart comes from the World Bank's 1997 World Development Report, which was called The State in a Changing World. And so the bank came to this, at that time, a fairly radical conclusion. Up until that point, they had been pushing the so-called Washington Consensus, which flowed very naturally from, in a way, the Reagan-Thatcher period when everybody was saying, well, the problem is government. You know, you got to get government out of the way. The state has to get smaller. We got to privatize, deregulate. And that was largely the agenda of these big international financial institutions and then development agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development. And so that's really an argument about where you're supposed to be along this x-axis, right? And it also corresponds to political fights. So the Republicans want the US government to be somewhere down here. They want it to do only the minimal necessary functions, and the Democrats and people on the left tend to want the government to be over here. And if you listen to American campaign rhetoric, it's just mind-numbing, because it's all about, you know, should we make it bigger, smaller, and so forth. And so I'm just going to make an argument that that's not the big issue, that you can actually make either a small government work very effectively or a large one, but what's much more important is actually the quality. So there's actually a y-axis that we have to pay attention to, which I call the strength of state institutions. Now, many of you who live in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian countries will associate state strength with its ability to put people in jail and to be repressive. And that's one way of thinking about strength. But I think about strength somewhat differently, which is the government's ability to actually implement policies that it decides on, many of which, as I said, are ones that are commonly desired by citizens. So, in fact, I was thinking, Nidal, about my experience when I was in Libya in 2006. So as I mentioned to you, I actually met with the colonel at that point. And I remember we're driving back to the airport. I had to catch a flight back to London out of the Tripoli airport. And we're going along with a police escort with all these sirens flashing, and we're driving at probably, 120 kilometers an hour.
Much more.
And then, yeah, much more, whatever it was. And then all of a sudden, this private vehicle from behind us, comes roaring down the street and passes this whole police motorcade going at least another 30, 40 kilometers an hour faster than the policemen were. And the policemen don't do anything about it, I mean, they just say, okay, fine. I mean, so there's a kind of level at which you can be simultaneously very repressive. You're really good at jailing journalists and activists and so forth, but you don't enforce your own speeding laws, or you don't, preserve citizen security for ordinary people, and so forth. And so that, I think, is what I mean by the strength of state institutions, the ability of states to actually effectively carry out the policies that they decide upon. Now, of course, we can argue about whether the policies are good ones or bad ones, but I would contend that a lot of the outcomes around the world really have to do with that basic capacity. That's really what we're talking about on that y-axis. So this is one effort to measure the quality of government. So this chart comes from the World Bank Institute's Worldwide Governance Indicators. As some of you may know, the World Bank Institute, not the bank itself, but its research arm, the World Bank Institute, has been publishing these worldwide governance indicators for about 10 years now, in which they try to rate the quality of different political institutions in different countries. And the two that I've singled out here, there are 6 of them in all. One of them is voice and accountability. One of them is rule of law, but the two that are listed here have to do with control of corruption and what they call government effectiveness. I actually don't like these indicators very well because I think methodologically the way that they're generated oftentimes is a little bit suspect. They're based on perception surveys of outsiders and so forth. But if you saw this chart and you had to say, where do these different, and some of your countries are listed on here. Sierra Leone, Emmanuel, doesn't do very well there, in terms of either corruption or state effectiveness. And, the distribution all the way up to Denmark and Singapore at that end of the distribution, I think, is probably what a lot of us would expect. Now, the question then is, where do you want to be as a government, all right? If you've got this 4-quadrant matrix, and so along this axis you say, well, do you want a big government that does a lot of stuff here, or do you want a kind of minimal, US Republican favored kind of government? And then, where do you want to be on the y-axis in terms of how effective the government is in doing whatever the government does? So what's the answer? Where do you prefer to be? Yeah.
Small and
Nina.
effective government. Small and effective government.
Small and effective. So you vote for quadrant 1, right?
2.
Okay, 2. Why 2? So Darko votes for this quadrant here.
Because I think that my ideological position is the government needs to have more function.
Okay. Are you a social democrat, would you say, roughly? Okay, so yeah, that's roughly right. So kind of liberal parties like being over here in quadrant 1, and the more social democratic types want to be there. Anyone vote for 3 or 4? No. Okay. Well, that's natural, because I think, as a matter of fact, almost what defines being a developing country is that you're either in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. So we can put some actual countries. This is a little bit different from the last time I gave this talk, because this is actually based on real data. So as a proxy for the size of the state, this data, the x-axis is how much revenue is taken in by taxes as a percentage of GDP, as a rough measure of the size or the scope of the state. And then government effectiveness is that World Bank index, right? And so you can see that countries distribute themselves along this upward sloping axis. And just looking at this, what would you say is the most interesting thing that pops out at you here? If you look at the different countries and where they fall on this graph.
The size of the states in the developed countries.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so first of all the developed countries are up here, basically in what I had said was quadrant 3, actually. Some of them, like the United States, are over here in quadrant 1, but every developed country is above this 0 line, right? And what's very interesting is that some of the most the richest and the most developed countries in the world are actually out in quadrant 3 with pretty large states, you know. And so if you try to tell this to a Republican in the House of Representatives, that actually the size of the state doesn't matter, you know, they'll just go crazy because they'll say, no, don't you know, the Laffer curve and all this, that, you know, too much taxation kills incentives and you can't grow and so. But empirically, that's just not true. That if you've got a high quality government, it's much more the quality of the government, I think, than the absolute, you know, or the relative size of the state that kind of affects, well, okay, so this is just effectiveness, but if we had put rates of GDP growth here, you would have seen, you know, a somewhat similar kind of distribution, all right? So what this tells me that actually it's that axis over there that's really pretty important. So this is, you know, I've changed the, well, so we're going back to the non-quantitative. So this is my tweaking of that last chart, because I actually think that the strength and the scope of the state can't adequately be measured by those two numbers, you know, that I put up. So I've kind of moved people around a little bit to reflect where different countries are. So you can see, like, the former Soviet Union is way out on the right side of the chart because no private property, you know, the state centrally plans everything. And then, so again, Emmanuel, I'm sorry, Sierra Leone, I mean, it's recovered a lot. So actually, I would say this represents, you know, the 1990s. Afghanistan is still probably down there, but Sierra Leone has been, you know, has been improving its state capacity. But, you know, this is the classic sort of failed state part of the, you know, the graph to be, all right? So this is one way of thinking of the kind of mixture of state scope and state strength that locates countries. Lilith,
So
you have
institutions would work well in former Soviet Union?
better than in Afghanistan, yes. It's all relative, right? I didn't put this former Soviet Union up here. You know, maybe Singapore, Denmark might be somewhere up there, right? But the Soviet Union, I mean, it certainly works better than a lot of very poor developing countries, all right? Okay, and then you can see how things have changed over the years. So this is my very schematic view of where Russia has wandered around. So they go from having a very large state in the Soviet period, and then they create a private market, they make private property possible, but then the quality of the state deteriorates very rapidly. So the 1990s, you had the rise of mafias and, you know, personal insecurity, and governments didn't work very well. And then Mr. Putin, as Catherine indicated, comes to power in 2000, and they start trying to push the state back up this way. But in my view, Dennis, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I don't think they've gotten very far. I mean, they've recovered from, you know, the sheer incapacity that existed in the 1990s, but nobody would say that the Russian state is a good, impersonal, you know, high quality institution. And it's certainly gotten bigger in terms of how much of the economy they seek to control. China is an interesting case because I think they've moved in a more positive direction. So, you know, at the end of the Cultural Revolution in the late 70s, they were again a communist country that tried to control everything, no private property. They create a private sector, so they move back down this way. You have the introduction of private property. But China, you know, actually tries to then, I mean, so the Chinese government at the end of the Cultural Revolution was virtually non-existent. You know, the Red Guards had taken over all the ministries, and ordinary government functions had really just ceased functioning. And then one of the things that Deng Xiaoping tries to do, in addition to the liberalizing economic reforms, is actually to rebuild the Chinese state. And the Chinese state, I think, is actually, you know, pretty capable in many respects. I was mentioning this to some people at lunch, but for example, just in terms of something like municipal water, you know, that's a basic state function that many, many developing countries cannot get right, or electricity, right? The Nigerian Electric Power Authority, NEPA, is known as no electric power anytime, because you just don't get power out of this grid for many hours during the day. But in terms of the delivery of public utilities in China, it's good. They had 97% coverage in China's large cities of urban water, and they achieved this by the early 1990s. And so quality of government has improved, and so they deregulated and downsized the state. They've gone backwards a little bit under Hu Jintao. State-owned enterprises are still pretty important, but one of the qualities of China is it's got pretty good government services relative, let's say, to India, where I would say probably the rate of municipal water and electricity provision, instead of being 97%, as China was in the early 1990s, today it's probably like 30 or 40%, right? So it's a democracy, but in certain respects it really doesn't do that well in terms of the effectiveness of its government institutions. And then finally, you got a country like New Zealand. So New Zealand is a country with like 3-4 million people and 60 million sheep. So it's very unrepresentative. It's a weird country in a lot of ways. But they went through a Margaret Thatcher type downsizing of the state's role in the economy in the late 70s and early 80s. So they eliminated a lot of tariffs. They privatized a lot of state-owned businesses. But they did something that a lot of countries going through this so-called Washington Consensus set of policies failed to do. They undertook a big reform of their public sector. So Americans have a lot of hang-ups, and one of the hang-ups that we Americans have is we don't like government, just period. We don't like government. There's a huge amount of distrust of government, and a lot of, there's a big libertarian faction that would like to get rid of government, pretty much altogether, whereas in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and Britain itself, I think there's a greater recognition that you got to have government to do certain basic functions, therefore you need to make government better, and so they instituted a series of reforms that I'll talk about in a minute under the heading of New Public Management. So they said, okay, we're going to have a smaller state, but the state that remains has got to be more effective. And they did things like putting their public officials under explicit contracts with explicit targets, so that the central bank governor in New Zealand actually has it written into his employment contract that if he lets the rate of inflation rise above a certain level, he's out of a job, or he certainly doesn't get his bonus for that year, right? So there are very clear standards for how they expect government officials to perform, and so in a sense they ended up, getting smaller but also better. And if you want a relatively small, deregulated state, New Zealand is one of the few countries that's actually managed to pull this off. Okay, so all of this is just a wind-up for saying that the y-axis here is really important. We spent, at least in this country, we spent all of our time arguing about where on the x-axis to be, and I think the real argument should be, how do you move up the y-axis, all right? And so that's really the subject of the talk. Primer on public management. I could have said a primer on public administration, but my experience is the moment you utter the words public administration, especially when it's close to 2 p.m. in the afternoon, everybody just falls asleep because they think this is the most boring topic in the whole world. But I actually think that in terms of achieving the ends that modern democracies are seeking to achieve, if you don't get this public administrative function right, you're not going to succeed, altogether. And again, one of the reasons that countries like China and Singapore are as widely admired as they are, it's not just that they're growing very rapidly in economic terms, because they've got pretty good macroeconomic management, but in terms of other things, their public services work well. They've got water, electricity, they've got relatively secure, streets. They've got governments that can actually deliver things that citizens want. And as I've said in one of the earlier lectures, a place like Burma, you can have democracy, but if a democratic government does not effectively deliver on some of these services, it's not going to take more than a few months before people, start saying, well, democracy is great, but, but. Okay, so question is, how do you move up the y-axis? So, so this is the point where I'm trying to answer Jeremy. So Jeremy was saying, well, the way you get to good government is you get better democratic. Well, first you get more transparency, and then you get more accountability. And transparency and accountability together should get you to better government. And I actually don't think that that's historically where good government comes from, for a number of reasons. So first of all, if we ask the question, what is good government, in the sense that I'm trying to define it in terms of the government's ability to do things, to actually implement things. So that first point is the one that Fernando made when Pascaline was here the other day, when she was talking about how do you control corruption. So obviously, a highly corrupt government is not good government, but if you get rid of all corruption, are you going to have good government? And I think the answer is clearly no, because you can have a very clean but a very weak and incapable, incompetent government at the same time, right? Yes. And so good government has to be something more than the absence of corruption. Governments positively have to do things, right? They have to provide public security, they've got to run court systems, they've got to regulate businesses, they've got to do lots of things in a proactive way. And if they don't have the capacity to do that, they're not going to deliver those services effectively. And so they need this thing called capacity. Now, capacity has this funny definition in the international development community. So Fawzia was talking about being in Washington among all the people in the development industrial complex. And I agree with you that it is this weird industry that's out there. And so you talk to a lot of people that work in these NGOs and at USAID and so forth, and they say, what do you do, to help these countries? And they say, we do capacity development, right? How many of you have been in a way, we're doing a capacity development exercise here. The Summer Fellows is a capacity. How many of you have been in a similar kind of seminar or teaching thing sponsored by some other international organization, right? A lot of you, right? Okay, more hands are going, right? So a lot of people do this sort of thing. When they say capacity development in development speak, usually they're talking about, something like this, where you go to a nice place for a few days, or we're actually at the long end of the scale because you're here for 3 weeks, but you go there for a few days and you pick up some, tidbits about one thing or another, and you go back to your country and you try to make use of them. In my view, that kind of capacity development is not what actually produces good governance. And I think it's because there's a difference between training and education. What we're talking about in most capacity development programs is what I would call training, and that is different from education, because education is a longer term process, and it is much more resource intensive, and it is much more important in actually shaping the people that go through it. So where does capacity come from when we talk about the capacity of a government? So here are some things. Resources. Now, resources, it's interesting. My former colleague, Melissa Thomas at SAIS, wrote this very nice article where she did a lot of empirical comparisons between different countries and how much different countries spent on their government services per capita, right? So as of maybe 5 years ago, the United States, for every man, woman, child, little baby in the country, spends about $17,000 collectively on aircraft carriers, schools, policemen, health services, all this kind of stuff. What would you think the amount per capita that the Afghan government spends is?
$100.
20.
That's too high.
You mean
Yeah,
annual
I mean-
number?
Each year?
Annual number? Is that an annual?
Yeah, annually, how much does the Afghan government spend per capita? So the number she cited was $17, right? Now, that's the Afghan government itself. If you include all of the international donors who have been pumping all this money into Afghanistan, that number rises to about $60, $70. But even at $60, $70, what kind of quality government services can you buy for $60 a person, right? For every person in Afghanistan. If you're thinking of having to hire policemen, teachers, doctors to run clinics, not to speak of the government ministers that have to ride around in their big, Land Rovers and so forth, right? So resources, just simple resources matter. And that's part of the reason that some rich countries, are able to have much better quality services than others, all right? People. So every country's got people, but it's really tied to the third sub-bullet, which is education, human resources, right? So capacity, and I think this is kind of the central thing about capacity, that if you don't have good people working in the government with adequate levels of training, you're going to be in big trouble. So in the early 19th century, the average American had about a 5th grade education, and you had a president, Andrew Jackson, who said, there's no reason why running the American government requires, great education, and anyone can do it. So the average federal government official, had like an elementary school education, if that. And you consider, could you run the Centers for Disease Control, the Federal Reserve, the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency? Could you run this with people with a 5th grade education? The answer is obviously no. When I was in Timor-Leste a few years back, we were in the finance ministry. So as you know, this used to be a little province of Indonesia. It became independent in 1999. And so we were in the finance ministry in Dili, and we're talking to an Australian consultant, and he said, in the finance ministry, if you don't count the minister and the vice minister, the average level of numeracy, meaning your mathematics skills in that ministry, was about 5th grade, and that there was not a single lawyer, accountant, or economist, native Timorese, in the entire ministry. And this is the most elite ministry in Timor, all right? So if you talk about lack, and these people actually have money because they've got now gas and a little bit of oil and so forth. So their lack is really not resources. It is, and that's why the foreign expats really have to run that government. The international community is basically the people that run their ministries, because they just do not have the human capacity to do things. And then finally, organizational culture. So anybody who's ever worked in an organization knows some of them are totally dysfunctional and others work really well, right? And you can get the same level of people, the same level of resources, and they will be extremely effective in one organization, and they'll be a disaster in another. And that's really, a lot of what management. So I'm going to get back to all of this stuff. And so this is a further slide. So this is one that I do to irritate people, but these are some famous bureaucracies in the world, all right? And actually, if you start to think to yourself, well, who's had a famous bureaucracy, kind of high-quality bureaucratic government? So the first I would put on this list is China, because they really kind of invent modern bureaucracy. They invent the civil service examination. They have this elaborate system for grading and promoting people. If you want to know why is it that the Chinese overseas, in places like Australia, the United States, Canada, why do they do so well as individuals? Why are they so rich and so upwardly mobile? I think there's a very clear answer to that, that in Chinese culture, literacy and education were the way that you got into the bureaucracy. And so for more than 2,000 years, if you were an ambitious, upwardly mobile Chinese person from a poor family and you wanted to get ahead in life, what did you do? Well, your whole family in your village sometimes would support you to get enough education that you could take the civil service examination. And if you passed that and got into the bureaucracy, your life was made, and your village's life would be made, actually, as well. And I think all the Chinese tiger mothers that are there, you know, staying up late at night, pushing their kids to study hard, you know, in a way, culturally, it comes from the fact that education was the key route to mobility through the bureaucracy, not through the private sector, because China really didn't have a private sector up until the last generation, but really upward mobility through the bureaucracy. Prussia, Germany, you know, this is another famous case where by the early 19th century, in fact, Max Weber, great sociologist, has this famous definition of what a modern bureaucracy was, that it's impersonal, that it's hierarchical. You don't buy your office in the bureaucracy the way they did in old regime France, but everybody is a professional with a high degree of training. That definition of bureaucracy really comes from Prussia and then Germany after it unifies. Now, one thing that's interesting about this list is every single one of these famous bureaucracies was, in the way they became famous because they were attached to very powerful educational institutions. And so one of the big reforms that happened in Germany, the so-called Stein-Hardenberg reforms, opened up the bureaucracy to competition from middle-class people, but made it based on educational requirements. And it happened simultaneously with a big reform of the German education system that really created the kind of modern German university. And so the elite middle-class people that could get into a German university and graduate then went into the civil service, and that's one of the reasons that that was a very high-quality civil service. France, again, the same. I mean, this happens earlier than in Germany, actually. Under Napoleon, they set up a series of administrative schools, and to this day, you know, there's this institution in Paris called the École Nationale d'Administration, which is their place where they train senior civil servants, and it's something like, you know, all but 2 of the last, you know, dozen prime ministers of France have been graduates of this. And in fact, the heads of big French corporations are usually graduates. They don't go to Harvard Business School or INSEAD. They go to ENA. India has got a big mess of a bureaucracy at a lower level, but they've got this elite Indian administrative service that the British actually originally set up. And at the top levels, you know, of the Indian bureaucracy, these guys are amazing. One of them was my doctoral student when I was at my last school. So this is the mischievous last question when you're talking about where does good government come from. How many of these countries were democracies when they set up these good bureaucracies?
None.
Or Japan, yeah, I didn't mention Japan.
No,
None of them.
None of them.
Why?
None of them, right? I mean, the origins of all of these bureaucracies occurred under non-democratic governments. And how did they go about doing this? They did it by investing in basically capacity. They created, in fact, Japan is one of the most amazing things. I mean, this is the little factoid that I discovered when I was doing research for my last book, that in 1880, so the Meiji Restoration, Japan ends its feudal period in 1868. They import a lot of Western institutions, including modernization of the bureaucracy. So in the year 1880, approximately 10% of all Japanese higher bureaucrats had a Western university education. Within 2 decades, so by 1900, 90% of them did, right? So they go from 10% to 90% having a university, a Western-style university education. And this is just, you know, this is mind-boggling. I mean, can you think of a single developing country that has managed to pull off that kind of an educational, you know, transformation, right? And it's, to this day, you know, the elite graduates of the law department, the law faculty at Tokyo University, their most elite educational institution, they're still the ones that feed, you know, the senior ranks of the Japanese civil service.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, when was that?
Between the year 1880 and the year 1900. So as Japan was modernizing and opening up to the West and so forth, all right? By the way, this is why I think a lot of these East Asian countries have a big leg up on other developing countries. But it's because of this Chinese cultural influence, this particular, relationship between bureaucracy, education, elite status, and so forth. And so, it's kind of translated into the ability to run pretty good quality government. Yeah.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I wanted to ask you, how come, for example, the Middle East or other countries where we were colonized, the French or the British didn't play the same role, and maybe as we come back to Biram's point that we need to do it our own way or to customize it. But in these countries, usually like in Napoleon or Meiji, there was always someone who was very strong and who believed in bureaucracy and believed in just we have to do something. So how we can do it now and build institutions regardless of...
Yeah, okay, so I don't want this to become another of these depressing points.
No.
That it's hard to do it. But I'll just ask you to wait a little bit on this. So we're going to do this case study on Gifford Pinchot and the U.S. Forest Service tomorrow afternoon. So the reason that I wrote this case, and I really like teaching it, is that the United States went from having a patronage-ridden, low-quality bureaucracy in the 1860s, 70s, to having a much more modern, professional, technically competent bureaucracy by the 1920s, all right? And that whole case is really the story of how did the United States do this? And the answer, I think, is it's political struggle, basically. Because the way you get from one institution to another, it's not just government one day or a strong leader decides to spend a lot of money on, universities and, lavish money on the bureaucracy, because there are plenty of countries that have lots of money they spend a lot of money on their bureaucracies, and it all gets frittered away in corruption or, it's diverted or, things like that. And so the way that you actually do this is a little bit complicated. So we'll get back to this question, of how do you actually get there. So capacity is really important. The building of state capacity is really important. It costs money, requires people, it needs an emphasis on education and not simply training, all right? Yeah.
May I make one comment? These countries certainly are not democracies and don't have that in common. But in addition to capacity that you emphasize, I think all of those countries, at a certain point in their development, are very much opposed to arbitrary government. That is, they are very rule-bound. They want, indeed, a certain measure of equality.
Yes.
People should be treated the same if they do certain things and so on. Now, those rules can be very diverse. But it strikes me really that I don't know enough about how the Brits ruled India at that time. But the other countries all have in common a certain kind of rudimentary commitment to the rule of law.
Yes. No, that's an excellent point. So there's this, the word that I forget whether maybe it was Steve Krasner that used it in his lecture, the Rechtsstaat, right? This is a rule of law state. And so even though Imperial Germany was, in theory, an absolutist monarchy or empire, the emperor, the king or the emperor, ruled through a bureaucracy that interpreted its role as implementing law. So it was not arbitrary. So, for example, something like property rights. In Prussia in the late 17th or 18th century, you couldn't just take away property, confiscate somebody's property arbitrarily. And in China, you had a similar kind of development. I mean, the Chinese have a lot of law, A lot of it was very punitive and very strict. But again, the Chinese bureaucracy saw its role as implementing law and not just the personal will. In fact, the emperor, neither the German, the Prussian king, nor the Chinese emperor actually could do very much of an arbitrary, in an arbitrary manner because they had to rule through the bureaucracy, right? So in a way, the bureaucracy becomes one of the first checks on arbitrary despotic government if that tradition of rule of law gets established. Now, it's another question of how you get there because that's not that easy. Okay, so now we're going to back up a little bit and talk about the following. Well, actually, no. Let me just say one more thing before we leave this slide. So I said that these bureaucracies became very powerful, competent, very autonomous. There's a big downside to all of them. So if you had to say something negative about the bureaucracies in this list of countries, especially, let's say, Germany and Japan, what would it be?
You can include British.
Or the British, yeah, but what's the big downside of having a really powerful, strong bureaucracy? Yeah, Fausia.
Okay, the rule of law is one thing, but the law itself is a very big
Right.
question mark.
Yeah, so what is it that they decide to do?
become dictatorship.
Right,
The
right.
power is too concentrated.
Yeah, there's a lot of concentrated power. So even though the law itself becomes something of a constraint, if the government is too capable, in a sense, and too strong, it escapes democratic control. And what happened in Germany and Japan in the 20th century? Well, in the case of Germany before World War I, you had a military bureaucracy that basically came up with a plan for fighting both Russia and France at the same time. And when the big crisis came in 1914, the chief of staff, the younger Moltke, goes to the Kaiser and says, well, I'm sorry, but we have no alternative but to fight on two fronts simultaneously. And so this great German bureaucracy ends up determining German foreign policy. And in the case of Japan, this army in Manchuria decides to launch a war against China, and the government back in Tokyo is powerless to stop it. So, too strong and too autonomous a bureaucracy is a bad thing, right? So somehow, so that sets up this next slide. So this is the question that is a basic question in all public administration, right? That you have to delegate authority to lower levels, to a bureaucracy, to an organization. But at the top level, you also have to keep control for precisely this Germany, Japan reason. And in a democracy, you have to keep control. There's no question that it is the people that should ultimately decide what it is that this powerful bureaucracy is doing. And if that control breaks down, you're in big trouble. But at the same time, you've got to delegate authority. And why do you have to delegate authority? So many reasons, right? People at the top of a government don't know what the hell is going on. They need to delegate authority to people on the ground that are actually aware of what's happening. Friedrich Hayek, the great economist, I think one of the most important articles he ever wrote was one that he wrote in 1945 called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And he said, in any society, the vast bulk of knowledge is local, right? Somebody's not taking out the garbage, or there's a public disturbance in the park, next door. Who knows about that? It isn't the central government. It isn't, even the NSA probably isn't going to know about it, although maybe they'll get to that point soon. But it's people on the ground that are right there. And so if you don't delegate to people that have local knowledge, you're not going to know what you're doing. And then expertise, right? So presumably all of you have worked in a hierarchical organization. Where does the expertise lie usually? I mean, where are the engineers and the professionals and so forth?
Universities, education system.
Well, no, but in a bureaucratic organization. I mean, a lot of times it's at the bottom, right? I mean, it's the workers that actually know how to run the organization, and sometimes the bosses don't have any, idea what they're doing. So expertise is there, and then oftentimes because people at the bottom of an organization are close to the, expertise, they have expertise and they're close to local knowledge, they're the ones that can respond quickly, right? If you have to, so there's a disturbance in the park, next to Encina Hall, and you have to report up several levels in a bureaucracy to some guy sitting in an office in San Francisco, it's going to take, a couple of hours before anyone responds, whereas if you can do this directly, you're going to have a much more responsive, right, system. And so this is not just governments, any organization has to reconcile centralized control. Somebody has to be in charge, somebody has to give the orders about what the organization does, but at the same time they've got to delegate. And so this is my capsule summary of all management theory, both in business school and in schools of public administration. This is the central problem, is that you got to somehow figure out how to delegate discretion, how to delegate authority to people and yet keep control of the organization itself. And so that's what a lot of the, these innovations are trying to reconcile. So there are basically two broad approaches to this, which I would label the economist approach and the what I would call the social capital approach. And they're basically based on two very different models of human behavior, all right? So the economists have a very straightforward view of why human beings do what they do. They are rational, utility maximizing individuals, where they're based, and utility, it's a, it basically means money. I mean, some economists will try to say, well, utility could be charity, or it could be, personal satisfaction of a non-monetary sort, but forget about it. I mean, economics does not make sense as a science if you start including all of these things in utility. Basically, it says people respond, primarily to monetary incentives to do things. And if you incentivize them properly and they're rational, then they will do, what you predict or what their models predict. So, and that leads to this so-called principal-agent framework by which most economists understand behavior in organizations. But there's an alternative way of looking at human behavior, which I think sociologists and anthropologists would be much more comfortable with, saying people are not rational individuals, they're social creatures. And what does it mean to be a social creature? That you're heavily motivated by norms, shared values, solidarity with other people. Now, as we'll see, I think actually both of these views are to some extent true, that actually we as human beings are both rational, calculating individuals, but we're also social creatures. And that's the problem, is that none of these theories is really adequate to explain the whole of behavior. But they lead to very different approaches to public administration, all right? So we've had references to principal agent, in Pascaline's talk and Jeremy to some extent this morning. So principal agent is a pretty simple explanation of how an organization works. The principal is up here. So this is a publicly owned corporation, all right, in a fairly developed economy. So principal are the shareholders. Who are the principals of Google?
Breen, Page, Mr. Breen, Mr.
No,
Page.
no, they're not the principal.
CEO. Google.
Shareholders, all right, and who are the shareholders of Google?
People using Google.
It's there's millions of them out there. I mean, it's anyone that owns Google stock, but how do the shareholders as principals express their point of view? They appoint a board of directors, right? So these people are all very dispersed, but there is a board of directors who are usually pretty well-paid executives from other companies, and their main job is to appoint Eric Schmidt, or he's no longer the CEO, but at one time he was, right? And so the principal are the shareholders, and then you have multiple levels of agents. So first level agent is the board of directors, second level agent is the CEO. The CEO hires the senior management. senior management hires the workers, all right? And so principal, agent, 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 all the way down. There are multiple levels of agency, all right? So under this model, the economists say the principals have an objective. The objective is to maximize return, the monetary return to shareholders. So where do troubles come from? All right?
Incentives.
Hmm?
The incentives.
Incentives for whom?
When you get the different incentives from the different agents.
Yeah, okay, so is it the case that the agents will necessarily have the incentive to do what the principal is telling them? No, why not?
Many levels.
Well, okay, so you could have a confusion of orders coming, from above, so that could be one thing. But what about just the interest of, let's say, senior management? Like, does the senior management always do what the shareholders want or expect? No, right? And in fact, sometimes they're just crooks. Enron, this famous energy company, fell apart because one of the senior vice presidents actually set up a shell company and was diverting money from Enron into that company at the expense of the shareholders, right? And so in corporate governance, a lot of the efforts have been to try to align the incentives of especially the senior managers, the CEO and the senior managers, to do the bidding of the shareholders, right? One of the most typical ways of doing that is by granting stock options, right? So the idea is that if and believe me, Eric Schmidt's got a lot of Google options, right? So if Google doesn't do well, he's not going to do well personally. And the hope is that this alignment of his incentives will, keep him working hard. Now, one thing we got to ask ourselves is that why Eric Schmidt gets up in the morning? That he checks the value of his options and he says, uh-oh, they're down,
No.
1 or 2% today, so I better go to the office extra early and really do a much better job today, right? But that's what the rational choice theory will tell you, is that that's what's motivating him. And it's pretty good motivation, basically. I mean, if you don't have any stake in the well-being of your organization at all, especially in a private sector organization, you're probably not going to care whether the results are good. And actually, that's one of the big problems in government, because most government officials don't have a private stake in whether the bureaucracy does well or not. They basically have a secure job, and they could sort of care less whether they're actually delivering efficient services. Okay, so that's a private sector organization. So in a public organization, like a bureaucracy, government agency, who's the principal? Let's just think about the universe of democratic countries for the time being.
Public,
Voters.
general public. People.
General public, right, or citizens, right? Citizens. So the citizens are the equivalent of the shareholders. So the tree looks a little bit like this. This happens to be a presidential system rather than a parliamentary system. So you've got kind of split authority here, but the theory is, the American Constitution begins, "We the people of the United States of America." They are the principals. They delegate power to an agent, the President of the United States, and then to individual legislators through process of voting. These people, in turn, preside over a bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy implements the actual policies. Sometimes they use private sector organizations to implement. Sometimes they do it themselves. But you get this, the same structure of authority. So why does corruption in government happen under this principal agent framework? Well, incentives, right? I mean, that's what Pascaline was talking about. That's what Jeremy was talking about. They don't have the right incentives, right? Government agents do not have the incentives to do what the people up here would really like them to do. They steal as customs agents, in that Costa Rican case, or they divert money, or they, manipulate elections so that they can stay in power, and so forth, all right? So the public sector faces a similar kind of problem as the private sector, but it's harder in the private sector, right? So why is the public sector a lot harder to, why is it harder to keep people honest in the public sector?
It's harder to motivate people.
Why?
It's harder because
I think the oversighting mechanisms are weak.
Yeah.
Because for private sector institutions, you would have audits all the time coming and, you know, whatever. It's
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean,
but for public sector,
maybe, although companies, particularly private companies, can also keep a lot of what they do hidden. But Dala's, your answer was,
it's just also because it needs to come back to political strategy, so it should be from up to down maybe, and it's more difficult to apply them. the
well,
strategy.
okay, but let's think about this. So go back to these guys. What keeps the CEO and the senior management honest?
Shareholders.
Alignment of incentives. A company makes money one quarter, they'll get a bonus, right? They've got a direct monetary incentive. So what about here? What about the people in the bureaucracy?
Getting paid salaries.
Yeah.
there are no incentives.
So this is one of the most fundamental tenets of public administration, that bureaucrats cannot share in the profits, any profits that their organization makes. Therefore, they've got no incentive. So what happens if you are presiding, you're working in a public agency, you've got a fiscal year that begins on September 1st, and it's now August, and you haven't spent all the money in your budget? What do, typically?
You start spending.
You spend money like crazy, right?
Yes.
Because if you end up the fiscal year with a surplus in your budget, what's going to happen to you?
You will cut your budget.
It'll be taken away from you.
Yeah.
You know, the
next
people
time
higher
you
up are going to,
And
the
here it
next
comes
time
then
you
the like
do not get the same budget, or you get less than
you
that,
get less, yeah.
and
So
corruption
actually,
in the like procurement and
Yeah.
you are-
no, I mean, you've got a positive incentive in a lot of ways to waste the money, because if you save the money, you don't get any private benefit out of it. The public doesn't get any, well, the public presumably does, you know, save money, but your private incentive is not to save that money. Your private incentive is to preserve your budget for next year, and so you're going to spend the money. So that's why every government agency in the world, at the end of the fiscal year, if they got any surplus, they're just trying to get the money out of the door as quickly as they can, right? Actually, one country that's tried to solve this is China, because they actually have come up with these schemes like the township and village enterprises, where local governments were empowered to actually start profit-making businesses, and they could actually keep the revenues that they made from this. And that's why a lot of Chinese local government officials got really, really rich. But this is something I think only China can actually make work remotely well. And even in China, it turned out that this was the source of a tremendous amount of corruption. You know,
Problem, the land confiscation, the real estate price, that's because like the local government, they need to raise money for their own expenditure, so we have a lot of problems.
yeah, yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, the Chinese have been among the most innovative in experimenting with these kinds of incentives, and actually have used private incentives in order to get, you know, their bureaucrats to, you know, to do things to promote economic growth, because they can then share in it. But outside of China and maybe a couple of other Asian countries, I can't think of anyone that's actually managed to make this work. Virtually every other country, if you're a public official, you know, you just get paid a fixed salary, and you can't profit from your government job. All right?
I think in Rwanda we have, there are two agencies, the revenue collection. They always have a target, and when they go beyond, they are given bonuses. So they always try to be so efficient in collecting the taxes.
Yeah, okay, so we'll get to that. So then the question is, how do you motivate people under those circumstances? There's one other big, you know, problem when you compare these. So in a private company, if you screw up big time, there's a big punishment that awaits you, right? Which is
You do not
Fired.
get
bankruptcy.
bankruptcy.
I mean, well, okay, you can get fired, just routinely, but ultimately, if your whole organization doesn't do well, it goes bankrupt and you lose your job, and everybody you know loses their job. In this situation, there's no equivalent of bankruptcy, right?
Get bailed out.
Yeah, so your agency screws up, but you still show up for work the next day and you collect your paycheck, and right? So there's no sanction for bad behavior in most public organizations. So this then gets you to, so this is a list of things that have been done in the last generation. And essentially what they're trying to do under this principal agent framework is to take practices from the private sector and try to move them into the public sector in order to motivate people the way people in the private sector are motivated. So new public management. So this was a big fad in public administration maybe 20, 25 years ago. And again, it was an effort to say, okay, we're going to put everybody under contracts and we're going to measure your performance just as we would if we're hiring, a CEO or a senior manager in a private corporation. And if you don't meet those expectations, you're out of here. We're just going to be able to fire you. So everybody's put on a term contract with very explicit performance benchmarks, right? And this is, again, taken straight out of the private sector, because what a lot of companies do is they benchmark the performance of their managers, and if you don't meet the goals, you're out, right? And if you do meet the goals, you got a bonus or something of the sort. Second one is adding an exit option, what's called an exit option. This comes from the development economist Albert Hirschman. Well, no, actually, that's not true. It comes from Milton Friedman, the big kind of libertarian economist, who, looking at the situation of public schools, so public schools are a classic bureaucracy. They're not doing well, students are failing, you can't fire the teachers, you can't fix the problem just by throwing more money at them. So Milton Friedman says, okay, what we're going to do is allow parents to, instead of just paying the teachers directly by the state, we'll give all parents a voucher for the equivalent amount of money that the state was spending on the school, and the parent can decide where to send their kid to school. So if the public school is doing a really bad job, the parents will take their money and go to a private school or go to a different public school, and the failing school will lose money and the good school will get more money, right? So it's a direct effort to inject market incentives, market-like incentives into the public sector. Wage decompression, so in Africa, in the crisis leading up to the debt crisis in the 1980s, it turned out that, first of all, most African governments were bloated. They have way too many public servants because they were being used essentially as a source of political patronage. But everybody was getting paid the same because, you just wanted to pay money to get people, your ethnic kinsmen or whatever, a job. And there was no incentive for good behavior. And so they said, well, if you pay really good performers more than really bad performers, then that's going to motivate them to perform well. Jeremy mentioned this, separating the policymaker from the implementer, and so the policymaker just makes the policy, but they can switch implementers if the implementer is screwing up. Public expenditure tracking surveys. So a lot of what Jeremy was talking about is in this category of things. More transparency, more accountability. If people know what's going on in their governments, they can take action, and so a lot of you are involved in this, right? I mean, that's what the press does, the free media, civil society groups. You want to get more information out about the behavior of government, and then you want to be able to hold those governments accountable. In my view, so again, in development speak, the words transparency and accountability are used all the time. As Jeremy said, the reason that the World Bank uses them is that they can't use free speech and democracy because the Chinese won't let them. So they say transparency and accountability. But if you think about it, what transparency and accountability really mean are monitoring and punishment. They're just nice words for that. We're going to monitor what you do, and we're going to punish you if you screw up, right? And so that's an approach. That's the major approach that the development agencies have taken to fixing bureaucracies. So the question is, all right, so that's just a summary. So all of these economic-based approaches have the following characteristics that, you know, they're all implementations of the principal-agent framework. So they all say, problem is that the agents aren't motivated to do what the principals want, and therefore we're going to monitor, we're going to change the incentives, we're going to make it so that the agents are going to be more motivated to do what the principals want. They work through incentives, meaning, again, usually money, right? And they try to mimic market mechanisms. So question is, we've been trying to do this now for a generation. We meaning the international development community. We've been trying to improve the performance of governments. And so in a way, this is kind of a, given what Jeremy said this morning, this shouldn't come as any surprise. But there's a lot of weaknesses with this approach. And the overall results have not been terribly encouraging. So first of all, it is really hard to measure a lot of things that governments do, right? Governments produce services. So you're a judge, okay? How do you measure the performance of a judge?
In the case of the Bhutanese judges, every month we have to submit a case report to see, and if there are cases which are in the court for more than a year or so, you have to justify why the case is with you, and then so every month that is one. Next thing, we have a code of conduct for the judges, which gives a number of things which it says what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Then we have this. I suppose we have the council, the Royal Judicial Council, which looks into the behavior of the judges and all that.
Okay.
But at the same
So
time,
that's impressive. I mean, you've actually got a lot of mechanisms
but
in
I
place.
think where we do not have accountability is you pass judgments. The judgments are not the High Court and the Supreme Court's judgments are given on the web on the internet, but for the lower courts, it's not really given on the website. So
Okay, but
that's
do you think you can measure the quality of a judge simply by how long it takes to try a case?
not really, but at the same time, it also helps. They are, I think,
It
in
motivates, right, to
practical-
speed things
in,
up.
In practical sense, in the sense that there are cases where a judge might not want to decide that case for many reasons. It could be political, could be, or you just don't want to give a judgment which might not which might have some repercussion on you. So you just leave it. But you do not have that choice. You have to justify why you have kept the case pending. So in a way, it helps a bit.
It helps a bit, okay? No, I'm sure that it does help a bit. But can you imagine a situation where actually people are so motivated to speed cases up that they actually just rush them through, you know, and don't give adequate time to actually consider, you know, evidence and hear witnesses because they've got such a strong incentive simply to, you know, to rush through things, right? And actually the quality of a judicial opinion is really hard. Like, so I take it that most judges among themselves, you talk and you kind of know who's a really good judge and who's not.
I think the submission of the report every month also serves as you say, that sometimes there's a competition within the judges that, oh, you know, I'm lagging behind, this person has this many cases.
Yeah,
and
but
this,
again, it's kind of based on these kind of crude metrics, right, about how
Yes,
many
yes.
cases you did.
It's not
But in terms of the judgment of the judge, so Gerhard, are all American judges equally qualified?
Certainly not.
You could look at the cases that the decisions were appealed to a
yes.
higher court.
Yeah.
Another one is the appeal mechanism, where your cases, the judgment which you pass, and if it goes up to the higher court for appeal, and of course, I think there has been no studies which has been done to see how this is gone. But
Yeah.
if your case is on appeal and then it comes back to you sometime for enforcement, that means you've done a good job. But if there are too many cases which goes up on appeal and
And they're
find that
overturned.
then
Yeah,
you do get.
Okay, so there are some ways of measuring, you know, the output of a judge, but it's a very complex, you know, business being a judge, and I think, you know, in the American system, we don't have a metric like that, right? I mean,
I think we have a good example here in California of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is the court that most frequently gets overturned by the Supreme Court. Does that mean that judges in the Ninth Circuit are weak? No, of course not. It means there are profound differences of the judiciary in the Ninth Circuit with the majority of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, right. So there's disagreement over how to evaluate the, the quality of a judge, right? And it can be ideology, it can be policy, a lot of things. Teachers are another great, that's single most difficult, problem in most countries. So if you use a principal-agent framework, you can try to go to vouchers, or you can just do a much more simpler thing, is try to measure the quality of a teacher and then either reward or punish the teacher on the basis of their performance. So why doesn't everybody do that?
It's blame and shame. It's not appropriate for education system. I don't know.
Why isn't it appropriate?
Just because also it would be subjective when you're a teacher. Like nobody would say, he's a good teacher because he shaped my personality. The other would say he was really a bad teacher.
Okay, so you got a little bit of this measurement problem, right?
Yes, criteria is not objective.
But people all over the world are trying to do this, right? They're trying to figure out how do you measure the quality of teachers so we can hold them accountable, all right? So how do people do this when that happens? Turn my cell phone off.
PISA system.
how
They would look at
PISA, okay, so there are certain metrics like the PISA scores that try to measure the quality of teachers. And in the United States, under the younger President Bush, we had this big policy called No Child Left Behind, which attempted to measure on a standardized basis educational scores across all 50 American states. And the purpose of this was going to be to hold teachers accountable, right? Transparency and accountability. This was the theory. So why is this difficult to do in education? Is it the case that you can really measure the output of an individual teacher?
Well, then the results of an educational system is long-term,
Yeah.
long-run results. So then you sometimes could assess the quality of the teachers by, for example, seeing at the results of the kids in different international tests. But then teaching it goes further beyond to just to know if the guy can read or not, that it goes to values and to other things that are really very difficult to assess.
Right, so just as a starting problem, a lot of the education researchers will tell you that only about 30% of the variance in test scores that they use to measure schools is actually due to the school itself. The other 70% is due to neighborhood, family, friends, a lot of other things. And then even if you try to measure that 30%, so your school gets really low grades. Can you identify who the good teachers are and the bad teachers based on that? You can't, right? And this is why no teachers union in the whole world likes transparent. You could say, well, who could object to transparency and accountability? Well, I'd say every teachers union in the world objects to it. They hate trying to monitor the performance of teachers and then trying to hold them accountable based on their individual performance, because the teachers say, look, we don't know how to measure this, and you're blaming us for these bad outcomes. That's due to the fact that the parents, are illiterate and they don't, have books in the home, and, they don't encourage the child to study, and so forth. So why are you taking it out of my salary? And in any event, even if you could do this accurately, every country in the world, or at least the democratic ones, has got a big teachers union and especially in Latin America, it's the most powerful private political organization in the country, and so they're going to stop you from doing this. And so even in the United States, we don't, demand full transparency and accountability out of our public schools. Okay, agents not I'm going to get to that. Multiple principals, this is another issue. So the whole principal agent assumes that the principal knows what he or she wants and then just gives an order to the agent. In many public sector agencies, you are plagued by the problem of multiple principals, meaning there are many different political actors who have the legitimacy to order a government office to do something, and those orders do not have to be logically consistent with one another. So classic case of this is a public utility, right? Why does the Nigerian Electric Power Authority lose money all the time? Well, on the one hand, you got commercial users that want it to be efficient. They don't care that much about the price, but they want electricity 24/7. But then you've got a lot of poor customers that just want some access, usually to subsidized electricity, and if they can't get that electricity, afford to pay it, they're going to steal it. And Lebanon's a good example. I mean, their electric utility, a lot of the electricity is actually
Cut.
diverted.
Like it's been
right?
more than 30 years that we're trying to have 24 hours electricity, and it's a whole corruption. It's like it's so corrupted that every time every minister just promises that you'll have electricity in all Lebanon, and now it's worse. It has never been worse. Like now in Beirut, you have always, people they go to Plan B and they have general like a motor.
Right.
And we pay like $800 a month, and you can imagine one day I was in a court, and I waited for an hour just for the cleric to do the judgment. So you can imagine on the big scale the impact of electricity on the whole country.
Right. Okay, so lots of public agencies operate under multiple mandates to do different things. Some of them coming from corrupt politicians, others coming from people that have just very different ideas of what the public interest is. They don't agree. And so how can, and if you compare this to a private company, there's a big difference, because in a private company, there's like one mandate, which is make as much money as possible, right? And you can measure that result. If the money doesn't show up in the corporate treasury, you haven't met your goal. Whereas in a public agency, you can't measure the goal, and you've got a lot of different contradictory instructions a lot of times coming down. Okay, so authority, so we talked about this a lot of times. Actually, authority actually flows. So the economists think that the principals are like God, They issue the orders, they know what they want and what they're doing, and it's just a matter to get all the subordinates to follow their guidance. But in any real-world organization, actually there's a bidirectional flow of authority. So the boss issues orders, but the boss may not know what he's doing. It could be that somebody at the bottom of the organization actually realizes that, the real policy should be different. And if you're a smart boss, you'll listen. You'll listen to people at the bottom that actually may have more expertise, have more awareness of what's really going on. And so the whole principal-agent framework, in a certain way, is very misleading if you think that authority only flows from the top down. So again, this is another way of putting it. And again, Tino in his talk mentioned this. This is a big area in administrative law. So as I said again, you have to be able to delegate, right? No set of rules can anticipate all possible circumstances. A lot of the expertise lies in the lower levels of your organization. You've got local knowledge and so forth. So then the question, so we're just going back to this. So again, how do you come to trust the agents, and how do you build trust in government? So again, this is kind of repeating some of the stuff we've done. So we already talked about strict rules, monitoring, and accountability, okay? So that's the economist's approach. Make a lot of rules and then force the agents to abide by them. But the last two are what I would call the second approach, which is the more social capital or kind of sociological approach to motivating people, right? So the trouble with principal agent is that it was designed by a bunch of economists. And frankly, the problem is with the economist model of behavior, is that people respond to incentives. And I think that that's just too narrow a way of understanding what really motivates people. So, okay, I'm going to skip over this. I mean, this is just to try to show you that not everything can be monitored under this principal agent framework. So, when am I supposed to be done with this session? Okay, so we're coming to the end. Okay. This is the last session of the day?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to keep you here to 5. All right, so, yes, I want to go home too, so. So I think there's actually a third form of capital which has been referred to as social capital, okay? So physical capital or financial capital, that's money, factories, machines, things that produce goods. Human capital is training and knowledge, so we talked about how important that is. Social capital is a little bit different because it's not an individual property, it's a property of groups. And it really has to do with the degree to which people can work together to cooperate. And there really isn't anything in either politics or economics that doesn't require cooperation. So that fortune cookie I got was actually very, it was onto something. Cooperation is important, right? So the question is, where does cooperation come from? So the economists will say, well, you just calculate that it's in your self-interest to cooperate. But in fact, most of the reasons that we cooperate don't have to do, like if my neighbor comes over to me and says, will you help me, move into my, house or something. I'm not going to say, well, okay, so is this neighbor going to help me if I have to move out? And, am I going to spend how many hours and how many hours will she spend working on my house? Nobody does that, right? I mean, you do it because there's a norm of cooperation, because, and in a certain sense, your own personality, identity is caught up with your ability to act in a certain way and be regarded by your friends and neighbors in a certain way as being, conforming with certain. Okay, that's not me because I turned my phone off. So I think that actually, if you look at any society, you actually have, one way of describing a society is in terms of networks of trust or networks of shared values or networks of, common norms. And so the large circle may represent a large society, a single large society, France or Italy or something like that, where there's a national identity that defines, who you are as a citizen of that community. But then there's smaller groups, there's ethnic groups, there's individual companies, institutions like Stanford University. If you're an alumnus or alumna of Stanford, you have something in common with other people that went to Stanford, right? So you can describe many societies in terms of these overlapping networks where people basically share values and norms. And this is true also in an organization where you've got shared norms that are, in common. And in fact, most business schools are divided between the economists and the management people. So the economists all talk the language of incentives. You got to incentivize your employees to do this and that. But the old line management people don't think about incentives so much. What they think about is motivating people essentially through leadership, norms, socialization, culture, because that's one way of solving the problem of hard to monitor activities. Okay, so I guess most of our faculty here are Stanford professors or fellows or whatnot. So how does, so Larry Diamond is, I guess, nominally my boss, because he's the director of the Center on Development. Yes. So how does he monitor my behavior? Like, is there transparency? Well, okay, so.
Taking notes.
Yeah, okay, well, for this 3 weeks, he can see that I'm showing up, for these sessions. But Larry's travels a lot, and I travel a lot. So how does Larry actually know that I'm doing my job, from day to
Evaluation
day?
forms?
Evaluation forms.
I've never filled out an evaluation.
Just go to Amazon.com.
But
No.
Deliverable
Agreed
thing.
outputs.
well, I don't know. I've never submitted a list of things I've done
We are
to.
going to evaluate you.
No, well,
Our evaluation.
maybe this is just poor management at FSI, but I've never filled out one of these things where I explain, what I've been up to, from day to day, right? Like in a lot of factories with low-skill workers, you've got a time clock, and so they want to make sure that you're at your job, so you stick your card in the time clock and you say, okay, I showed up at 8 o'clock and I left at 5 o'clock. Universities don't do that, And in fact, universities, some professors come into school like 1 day a week. The other 4 days a week they're at home and they say they're working, but there's nobody there to monitor them. But why doesn't this lead to a huge amount of abuse? I'm not saying that it doesn't actually with many professors, but generally speaking with professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects,
The reputation.
It's their reputation.
A reputation. One day you'll go to another university and they'll ask probably Stanford how he was, or the students, like, it's reputation.
Right, and so, so it's reputation, but isn't it something more than that? So reputation means you don't want people to think badly of you. But if you're a professor who slacks off, doesn't really produce any research and so forth, even if nobody notices that on the outside, how are you going to feel about yourself? Bad, right? Because you have pride, right? You have an internalized norm that says, I want to be a really good, political scientist or biologist or whatever, right? And so to some degree you can measure this by your output. How many articles did you produce? But actually, with a certain class of people that produce complex services, we don't measure very precisely what they're doing. We rely on them, in a sense, to monitor themselves because they've got pride, they've got professional standards. This becomes very important in some fields like software. So I guarantee you at Google, Eric Schmidt has no idea how to evaluate the quality of the software that his engineers are writing. You can tell when it's got a problem if it stops working, but how do you know that those engineers are writing the best code they can? And actually Google allows a lot of their guys to work at home or to work at the beach or this sort of thing. So how does he know that they're doing the best job they can? And a lot of that
Customers.
yeah, so there's trust, but on what basis? And I would say that the trust,
Knowledge-based.
No.
well, okay, it's
Feedback
knowledge
from
based,
the
yeah, but
Incentives as well, like in
Well-
Google, it's the best company in the world, so they know that they will have this job if they work well, and nobody wants to.
yeah,
do
but
the
since
job.
you actually can't get into the code and there's not a manager that's going to look over your code and say, oh yeah, you did that really, you did that really well. The economists call this the problem of hidden or joint output, where you're contributing to a collective enterprise. You know that the collective enterprise is doing well, but you can't actually measure the individual contribution to that common enterprise. There's a lot of things that are like that, right? And so the question is, how then do you use transparency and accountability to reward individuals when that's the case? And I would simply argue that you don't use incentives at all, at least not that kind of monetary incentive. Those can be important, but a really important source of the motivation is the social motivation that you, inside you, you want to do the best you can because you've got professional standards, you've been trained, to do a certain job, and you feel bad about yourself if you know that you're slacking off. And obviously, I think any well-functioning organization should not just rely on that, because everybody will slack off, if they're not, given real kind of tough incentives every now and then. But for a lot of activities, you don't rely actually on this principal agent stuff, and explicit monitoring and accountability, but you rely on the way that you socialize people. So I don't know whether I've got any more. Oh yeah, so question is, where does social capital come from? Where do these internalized values and norms? And so in a traditional society, kinship, local culture, every society has a lot of local rules that people are raised to to follow. In modern societies, I think the shared goals and values are actually generated institutionally. And a lot of it, has to do with the way that people are educated. And that's why the behavior of people changes very dramatically when they're given, higher levels of education, and particularly professional education. So most professions do not simply teach their students, the kind of the tools and tricks of the trade, and they don't tell them, okay, your main job in life is to maximize your income, and we're going to give you the medical skills or the architectural skills to help you do that. They say, no, you're a doctor or an architect, you're part of a proud tradition, and you're going to design great houses, or you're going to cure the sick. The only profession that's no longer a profession is going to business school, because there it's too dominated by economists who will then tell everybody your only job is to make as much money, you as an individual have got to make as much money as possible. But every other profession tries to inculcate a certain set of norms that are related to, the activities of that profession. And so there's a lot of socialization that goes on in that educational process. And so that's why I'm saying that, in thinking about state capacity, first of all, some of that capacity is not just in resources or the number of people you've got working and that sort of thing. A lot of it is in the values and the socialization of the people that operate in the government. And this is an alternative way, and I think this is actually, if you go back to that list of great bureaucracies, so let's just, whoops, okay. So in every single one of these really great organizations, this normative socialization framework was really, really important, right? So every one of them paid a lot of attention, not just to giving technical skills to their, the people operating inside them, but they socialized them into a culture that, emphasized high quality service. So for the best military, okay, so BIRAM, high quality military organization, right? Doesn't it seek to do exactly that, right? That if a soldier is just thinking, what's in it for me, they're never going to actually cooperate and take the sorts of risks that a military organization needs to take. So therefore, part of professional military training is exactly this sort of socialization into the norms of an organization. So all of these bureaucracies, part of the reason they were great was they developed this very tightly bonded, organizational culture that allowed people to, it allowed trust in a certain sense, that the Prussian, bureaucrat could be trusted to implement the law impartially because that's the culture of the bureaucracy, not because there was somebody monitoring their behavior and trying to hold them accountable, because there wasn't any accountability. I mean, there was basically, it was a authoritarian dictatorship. All right. So, yes.
We develop in our case what we call responsible leadership, which does not require too much monitoring and evaluation. We try to sensitize you to a point that you consider yourself as one of the owners of the organization, and the organization matters for you. So you will be, you're self-motivated.
Right.
Because you don't want your organization to fall apart.
That's the key, right? It's that self, how do you inculcate that self-motivation? So why is it that in the US military they spend so much emphasis on getting, their guys out? If you're wounded in a battle and you're in great danger, people will take huge risks in order to pull their buddies out of a very dangerous situation. A lot of times that leads to even more people getting killed and wounded, right? So in a purely rational setting, you'd say it's not worth it. The risks outweigh the rewards. But military organizations don't, the good ones don't train their people to think in those short-term ways because, you need to bond people to the organization. And the way you do that is, by saying, yes, we will take any risk, because you're one of us. Not that you're a citizen of the country or, you're loyal to an ideology, but you're one of us, you're one of our group, and we're not going to leave you behind, all right? Yes?
I agree and understand the concept you're presenting, but I also want to add that especially I'm not very familiar with how Japanese were seen, but the Indian Administrative Services, I'm not sure if that trust was with the people. I think that trust was with their officers and themselves, because that mini-god concept that was inculcated in those days, still we have that. So it was more inwards, and it was more towards their superiors, because they were like mini-gods. So in a sense, they had incentives of being very powerful people too. So it was not like these days bureaucrats who didn't have the discretion. So these were so not just the bonding, but the power and everything else bonded them so much that they were like a superior species.
Yes. Okay, so maybe this is a good point to end up at. So I do not want to leave any of you with the impression that what I am saying is that everybody needs to create a Prussian or a Japanese style, elite bureaucracy that, just does what it wants, and they're like gods and they're incredibly powerful. And so that's not the point of this. So all government organizations have to be under democratic control. So the principal agent, framework remains, basically right, that the people, through their elected representatives, have to control these bureaucracies. But the big problem is you've got to somehow balance democratic control of these organizations with the need for capacity, expertise, enough autonomy to actually do, the right thing. And that is a really hard, thing to do. And that's why I don't think there's such a thing as any kind of administrative science, because every case will be different. You can do things in China that you simply couldn't do in Zimbabwe or, some other place, Senegal, wherever. Okay, any other? Yes.
I just wanted to make a little comment on the one of the critics of the principal and agent theory, and it's related with the incentives. Sometimes you can really create some incentives that at the end create a perverse situation in government. It's the case of Colombia under the previous administration, when the army got some rewards of money and time for rest, according to how many guerrilla members which will each soldier to kill. And at the end, what happened is that these soldiers just kidnapped some people from young people from different places, and then just kill them and dress them like as guerrillas. So it's just the thing of thinking how incentives. Agents sometimes are not motivated by incentives alone, but sometimes those incentives could be really perverse.
You've got to really think through very carefully what the impact is. And I think when you're designing one of these systems, you'll never get it right the first time around, right? And so you kind of got to go back and experiment and see generally what works. Okay, so there's a lot of other issues that we could deal with, but I think this is, so again, I'm going to do this Gifford Pinchot in the U.S. Forest Service case. You must read the case before the class again, because otherwise you won't get anything out of it. So this gets back to the question of then, how do you go from a low quality, pretty corrupt, political patronage-driven bureaucracy to a much more modern, professional, high standards one? Because that's what the United States did 100 years ago. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.